Okay, so ready to dive into something that feels honestly kind of relevant to well, everything these days.
I'm all ears. What is it?
Security.
Okay.
Yeah. You sent over some excerpts from a textbook chapter about what security even means in our, crazy modern world. And it's got me thinking.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of those terms, right? Like, where do you even start?
Exactly.
Because we hear it everywhere. National security, economic security, cybersecurity. It's like, if everything's important, nothing is.
Totally. And this chapter jumps right into that. It basically asks, how do we differentiate between, everyday risks and serious threats to our security? Because walking to my car at night, sure, it has a little risk, but I wouldn't call it a national, security crisis.
It's about boundaries, right? Where we draw the line. And the chapter, it kind of pushes us past just feeling threatened. It argues that true security threats, they target the very core values of a nation.
Okay, hold up right there. This is where it gets interesting to me. Because whose core values are we talking about here?
Right.
Like, do entire nations actually have a unified set of values? Or are we talking about the values of, whoever's in charge at any given moment?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And the chapter really digs into that. It highlights how complicated it even is to define core values in the first place. Is it about, individual freedom, economic prosperity, national sovereignty?
Right.
And it even asks us to consider, how should we prioritize these values when they clash? Because, newsflash, they totally do.
It's like when you're trying to decide on pizza toppings. Everyone's got strong opinions, and suddenly national security looking as complicated as Friday night dinner.
Way more complicated than you might think. Because once you start talking about core values, then you have to ask, whose security are we really talking about? And whose responsibility is it to protect those values? It's a rabbit hole.
Which, by the way, military might is usually the first thing that pops in my head when I hear security.
Yeah.
Right? But this chapter, it's making me question, everything I thought I knew about this.
And that's exactly the point.
All right, so we've got these core values floating around out there, but as this chapter points out, the actual threats to those values, they're changing too. It's not all, armies and invasions anymore.
It's so true. And the chapter does a really good job, I think, of contrasting what we think of as traditional security concerns with this whole new, landscape of non-traditional threats.
So traditional security being, remind me again why I'm picturing a Cold War bunker right now.
Because that's the classic image, right? One nation state, feeling threatened by another nation state's military power. So it's all about defending borders, projecting strength, that whole chess game of alliances and deterrence.
Yeah, got it. Mutually assured destruction, very traditional. But then things get really interesting when this chapter gets into non-traditional security. It's suddenly the threats aren't wearing uniforms anymore.
And they're not always coming from other countries either, right? The chapter, it throws out some big ones right away. Terrorism, obviously. But then poverty, pandemics, all these things that can destabilize a country from the inside out.
And you can't exactly fight those with, tanks. It's like trying to fight a virus with a hammer.
Exactly. And the chapter actually argues that sometimes those traditional military responses can actually make these non-traditional threats worse.
Okay, example time, because, whoa. How could a military response backfire when you're talking about, a global pandemic?
Okay, so imagine, right, a highly contagious virus emerges. And now imagine countries reacting by, closing borders, hoarding medical supplies, maybe even deploying troops to enforce quarantines. Sound familiar at all?
Disturbingly so.
Yeah, right. But the point is that kind of, isolationist, militarized response, it actually undermines the global cooperation you really need to contain a pandemic, sharing information, coordinating healthcare efforts. Those are the real weapons in a situation like that.
Which is completely different from how we traditionally think about security. It's almost like the old playbook. It doesn't work anymore.
Exactly. And to really illustrate this, the chapter uses a really powerful example, which is climate change.
Oh, right. They talk about how rising sea levels could literally wipe entire island nations off the map. So how do you even begin to address that militarily?
Right.
You can't.
Exactly. You can't. And that's the whole point. Some threats are just so big, so complex, that they demand a totally new way of thinking about security. One that goes way beyond just military might. This idea of international cooperation, sustainable development, and even, get this, trust.
Trust. Between rivals even? That's a tough sell, especially when you've got, a history of conflict.
Oh, it is. It is, and yet the chapter argues that it's becoming more and more essential because when you're facing, something like climate change, the only way to survive might be to work together, even with countries that you don't always agree with.
Which brings us to, like, the million-dollar question. How are countries actually grappling with all of this in the real world?
Well, this is where things get really interesting because the chapter dives into a case study that I think you're going to find really fascinating. It's all about India's approach to security in the 21st century.
Okay, yeah, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. So India, it's a country that's like no stranger to security threats. And we're talking both, traditional and the newer, more complex kind, right?
Yeah.
So, like, what's their strategy for handling all of it?
Well, what I find really interesting about India is that, they haven't just tossed out the old playbook, right? Like, they've got this multi-layered approach that really seems to acknowledge, the world as it is today.
Okay, yeah. So unpack multi-layered for me. What's that look like in practice?
So on the one hand, they've invested, like, heavily in their military. And, I mean, let's be real, with neighbors like Pakistan and China, both nuclear armed, by the way, it's understandable why, traditional military power is still important to them.
Makes sense. You don't want to be caught slacking when you've got, that
Yeah.
kind of neighborhood. But it's
Mhm.
got to be more than just, guns and ammo, right?
Mhm.
Especially with all the other stuff we were just talking about.
You're totally right. And that's where the whole multi-layered thing really comes in. India has also been a big proponent of international cooperation. They've been huge supporters of the UN. They've really pushed for global disarmament treaties. It's like they're trying to build strength on multiple fronts all at the same time.
So it's like they're saying, yeah, we need a strong military, but we also need a strong global community.
Yeah.
Kind of like a don't put all your eggs in one basket approach to security.
Exactly. Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. And this is something the chapter highlights. India sees democracy itself as a key part of their security strategy.
Wait, hold up. Democracy as a security strategy. I've got to hear more about that because that's not something you hear every day.
I know, right? It's like they're flipping the script.
Hmm.
The idea is that, like, a political system that allows for open debate, where different groups can, voice their grievances peacefully, actually makes the country more secure in the long run.
It's about having those, tough conversations out in the open instead of letting them just simmer and potentially blow up later.
Exactly. It's about building a society that's resilient and not just like militarily, but socially and politically as well. And, by working to reduce things like poverty and inequality, they're addressing some of the root causes of a lot of these non-traditional security threats at the same time.
It's like they're saying true security isn't just about, building walls and stockpiling weapons, but it's about building a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a message that I think, resonates far beyond just India. This whole discussion we've been having, this whole deep dive into security, from those initial questions about like core values to India's approach, it really challenges us to think differently. It's a reminder that in the 21st century, security is about so much more than just military power. It's about cooperation, sustainability, social justice, and yeah, even trust.
It's about recognizing that the world is changing and the old ways of thinking, they just might not cut it anymore. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. What is building a truly secure future? What does that look like to you?